Chapter 1. The Call. Flying had been my life for as long as I could remember. It was a job that demanded precision, discipline, and focus, but it also gave me a sense of freedom nothing else could. On that particular day, though, the cockpit was the last thing on my mind. It was a rare day off, and I was at home, flipping pancakes while my kids ran circles around the kitchen. Their laughter filled the air, mixing with the sizzle from the stovetop and the soft moan of the radio. My wife was seated at the table, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone, her expression one of rare peace. For once, everything felt normal. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at it on the counter, tempted to ignore it. Calls on my day off usually meant something last minute, something urgent. But when I saw my manager's name, I hesitated. His calls were never casual. With a sigh, I wiped my hands on a towel and answered. "Hey, we've got a situation," he started without preamble, his tone brisk. "Diddy needs a pilot. As usual, guys are out sick, and it's short notice. You're the best option." "Mitty? As in Sean Combs?" I asked, eyebrows raising. This wasn't the kind of client you heard about every day. "There," he said, voice dropping slightly as though the name alone demanded reverence. "It's an exclusive gig, 5 days, private jet, and a payout that'll make your jaw drop." I felt a twinge of excitement, but it was quickly overshadowed by unease. "Why me?" I asked, skeptical. "Don't they have backup pilots for situations like this?" "Do," he said quickly, "but everyone's booked or unavailable. Look, I wouldn't be calling you unless this was a golden opportunity. This kind of payday doesn't come around often. Think about what this could do for you and your family." That part hit home. The paycheck was tempting. Too tempting. Flying a cultural icon like Diddy wasn't just another job. It was the kind of assignment that could elevate a career, or at least help me breathe easier financially for months. But something about the whole thing felt rushed, disorganized, the kind of chaos that often led to trouble. "What's the catch?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Some strict confidentiality," he replied, a bit too casually. "You'll need to sign an NDA. They're big on privacy." The hesitation in my voice must have been obvious because he doubled down. "Look, this is a chance to prove yourself. Plus, the accommodations are top-notch. Luxury hotels, catered meals, the works. It's only 5 days. You'd be crazy to pass this up." I hung up the phone, torn between the offer and a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. When I told my wife, her reaction was immediate. "I don't like it," she said, her brow furrowing. It sounds too good to be true." "No, inner light. It's just 5 days," I said, trying to sound confident. "It's a job. I'll be back before you know it, and the money will be worth it." She didn't seem convinced, and to be honest, neither was I. Still, the next morning I packed my bags and drove to the airport. The unease from the day before lingered, growing stronger with each mile. When I arrived at the private hangar, I was greeted by my manager, who handed me the flight details. The itinerary was vague, listing only the departure time and destination, a remote island somewhere in the Caribbean. The rest of the document was filled with legalese, emphasizing the importance of discretion and professionalism. "Sign here," my manager said, pointing to a line at the bottom of a confidentiality agreement. "This is standard for high-profitable clients." I hesitated. The terms were strict. No photos, no outside communication, no discussing the flight or its passengers. Breaking the agreement would result in severe legal and financial consequences. The language was ominous, but I needed the money. With a sigh, I signed. The jet was already on the tarmac, a sleek, state-of-the-art machine that practically screamed wealth. As I climbed aboard to begin my pre-flight checks, I noticed a few peculiar details. The cabin was stocked with luxury amenities, crystal glassware, a fully stocked bar. But there were also odd items scattered around. Bottles of baby oil sat on a side table. and a duffel bag, partially unzipped, revealed what looked like children's toys. It was a strange mix of opulence and something else. Something that made my skin crawl. The co-pilot arrived shortly after. He was an older guy, grizzled and quiet, the kind of man who had seen it all. I tried to strike up a conversation, but his responses were short, almost dismissive. It was clear he wasn't interested in small talk. "It's their jet," he said at one point, shrugging. "Their rules. Don't ask questions." It wasn't exactly comforting. Then Diddy arrived. He stepped onto the plane with an entourage of models and security personnel, his presence commanding the space instantly. Everyone seemed to hang on his every word, laughing at his jokes, nodding at his comments. Behind them, a small group of children filed in, their faces expressionless. They were dressed impeccably, almost like miniature adults, but there was something off about them. They didn't speak, didn't smile, they just sat silently, their eyes downcast. My discomfort deepened as the flight got underway. From the cockpit, I could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and conversation, but there was an edge to it, a forced quality that made my stomach churn. At one point, I glanced through the cockpit window and caught a glimpse of the cabin. Diddy was pouring drinks, his entourage laughing uproariously at something he'd said. The children, meanwhile, remained motionless, their expressions blank. I turned back to the controls, trying to focus. "Just a job," I muttered to myself. 5 days, that's it. But deep down, I knew this was no ordinary job. Here, Chapter 2, Boarding the Plane. The sun was just beginning to rise as I pulled into the private hangar, the early morning light casting long shadows across the tarmac. The jet was impossible to miss, a sleek silver beauty that seemed to gleam brighter than anything else in the vicinity. It was the kind of plane that exuded wealth and exclusivity, a testament to its owner's status. But as I approached, the air around it felt heavy, as if something unseen was weighing it down. I stepped onto the jet for the first time, and the interior was exactly what I expected, and then some. Plush leather seats were arranged in a layout that screamed luxury over practicality. The walls were lined with polished wood paneling, and a fully stocked bar stretched along one side of the cabin, complete with crystal decanters that caught the morning light. Even the lighting felt opulent, dimmed to a soft golden glow that made the space feel more like a high-end lounge than an aircraft. Yet, amid all the extravagance, there were details that didn't belong. Bottles of baby oil sat haphazardly on a small side table near the rear of the cabin, as out of place as a winter coat in the middle of summer. A stack of toys was tucked into a corner, the kind that looked handcrafted, eerie in their precision. With overly large eyes and unnatural expressions, a drink cart was stationed near the bar, already loaded with glasses of what I assumed was champagne. Though the pinkish tinge of the liquid gave me pause, I told myself it was just the eccentricity of wealth, but the uneasy feeling from earlier crept back. The woman stiffened and staggered a little. The co-pilot arrived shortly after I did, a man who looked like he had been flying planes for decades. He gave me a curt nod, introducing himself as Frank. I tried to strike up a conversation as we began the pre-flight checks, but he wasn't interested in talking. His responses were clipped, his tone brusque. "First time flying someone like Diddy?" I asked, attempting some small talk. Frank didn't look up from his clipboard. "Stick to flying," he said, his voice flat. "That's all you need to worry about." Marcus nodded and stood with Frank, taking the cup of tea from him. The dismissiveness caught me off guard. He finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You'll see soon enough. Just do your job and don't ask questions." With that, he turned his attention back to the controls, effectively ending the conversation. His words should have been a warning, but I brushed them off as the grumblings of someone burned out on years of high-profile assignments. Still, the unease simmered beneath the surface. About half an hour later, the entourage arrived. The guards. Diddy stepped onto the plane first, dressed in a tailored suit that looked like it had been made for a king. He moved with the kind of confidence that only comes from being at the top of the world for decades. Behind him was a group of models, each more stunning than the last, their laughter and chatter filling the cabin as they took their seats. They were dressed to the nines, their makeup and outfits making them seem less like people and more like living works of art. Then came the children. There were about half a dozen of them, boys and girls ranging in age from maybe 5 to 10. They were dressed impeccably, like miniature adults attending a formal gala. The boys wore tiny suits, and the girls had dresses that looked like they belonged on a red carpet. But their faces were what struck me the most. Pale, expressionless, and unnervingly blank. They moved in unison, their eyes downcast, never meeting anyone's gaze. They took their seats without a word, sitting with backs straight and hands folded in their laps. The models laughed and joked, but the children remained silent, like dolls brought along for decoration. It wasn't just the children who seemed off. The security detail that followed the group was equally unnerving. Their movements were calculated, their eyes scanning the cabin as if they were expecting trouble. One of them, a man built like a linebacker, caught my eye as I stepped out of the cockpit to check on the passengers. "Stick to flying," he said in a low voice, his expression stern. "Don't get curious." It was the second time I'd heard that phrase that morning, and it sent a chill down my spine. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything, and returned to the cockpit. Frank was already seated, his hands moving expertly across the controls. "Ready?" he asked, his tone neutral. I nodded again, strapping myself into the pilot's seat. As we prepared for takeoff, the sound of laughter and conversation filtered in from the cabin behind us. It should have been comforting, the normal noise of passengers settling in for a flight, but there was something off about it. The laughter felt hollow, forced, like everyone was performing for an unseen audience. We took off smoothly, the jet climbing into the clear blue sky. From my seat, I could see the world shrinking below us, a patchwork of greens and blues that stretched to the horizon. For a moment, I let myself relax. Flying always had a way of calming me, grounding me in the precision and focus it required. But that peace didn't last long. As we leveled off, I glanced into the small mirror above the cockpit controls. It gave me a partial view of the cabin, and what I saw made my stomach tighten. Diddy was at the center of it all, pouring drinks and cracking jokes, his charisma commanding the attention of everyone around him. The models laughed loudly, leaning in close as they sipped from their glasses. The children, meanwhile, sat unmoving, their faces as blank as before. At one point, a model tried to hand a drink to one of the boys. He shook his head almost imperceptibly, his small hands gripping the edge of his seat. The model shrugged and turned away, laughing as though nothing had happened. "What are you looking at?" Frank asked, his voice breaking through my thoughts. "Nothing," I said quickly, turning my attention back to the controls. "Good," he said. "Don't." The rest of the flight passed in a tense, uncomfortable silence. I tried to focus on my job, on the altitude and speed and navigation, but my mind kept drifting back to the cabin. The laughter, the silence, the strange items scattered throughout. It all felt wrong, like puzzle pieces that didn't fit together. When we finally landed at a private airstrip on a remote island, I felt a wave of relief. The passengers disembarked quickly, disappearing into waiting cars that whisked them away to a nearby estate. I stayed behind with Frank to complete the post-flight checks, the weight of the morning pressing heavily on me. "Welcome to the big leagues," Frank muttered as he stepped off the plane, his tone more resigned than celebratory. Exercise as Dad had taught me to reduce distress. I didn't respond. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into something far bigger and far darker than I could understand. My mind drifted back as far as it could go. Then suddenly I felt myself plunge down. Chapter 3. The Flight. Once we were in the air, the cabin began to take on a life of its own. Or rather, a strange, unsettling version of life. It started subtly, as these things often do. The initial burst of conversation and laughter from the adults tapered into something louder, freer, and altogether more chaotic. Diddy's entourage wasted no time delving into the stocked bar, passing drinks around with the enthusiasm of people who didn't need to worry about limits or consequences. The air grew thick with the clink of glasses, bursts of loud laughter, and occasional cheers. But it wasn't just the drinking. One of the models casually dumped a shimmering pink powder into her champagne, swirling it with the kind of practiced ease that suggested this was routine. Others followed suit, popping pills or sniffing substances off the glossy mahogany tables. Their energy shifted as the substances took hold. Gestures became more exaggerated, laughter turned manic, and conversation devolved into a tangled mess of inside jokes and incoherent babbling. The children, in stark contrast, sat perfectly still. They didn't squirm in their seats, didn't fidget, didn't make a sound. They stared blankly ahead, their eyes occasionally flickering toward the adults, but never lingering. At one point, a girl in a white dress clutched the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her gaze darted to the models laughing around her, then back to her lap, where her hands trembled ever so slightly. I couldn't make sense of it. Kids that age should have been full of questions, bouncing around the cabin, excited about flying in a private jet. But these children were unnervingly subdued, like they were playing a game no one had explained to me. The cockpit felt like the only sanctuary from the strange atmosphere, though even there, tension lingered. Frank and I worked silently, our hands moving over the controls with mechanical precision. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even with the cockpit door locked and sealed. I glanced at the small window above the controls again, unable to resist stealing another look at the cabin. What I saw made my stomach twist. Diddy had taken center stage, as expected, but his demeanor had shifted. He leaned back in his seat, his arm draped over the backrest like a king surveying his court. He wasn't drinking as heavily as the others, but his presence commanded the room. The models gravitated toward him, laughing at jokes he hadn't finished, hanging on every word he said. The children, meanwhile, were still in their seats, unmoving. At one point, a boy turned his head ever so slightly toward the models, only to quickly snap it back to its original position when Diddy's gaze swept over him. "What are you looking at?" Frank asked, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. I jolted, realizing I had been staring at the scene too long. "Just checking on the cabin," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Everything looks normal." Frank's lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't lie to me," he said flatly. "And? Don't look again." "What's going on back there?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. "This doesn't feel right. The kids—" Frank cut me off. "Stop," he said sharply. "I've been flying these kinds of jobs longer than you've been a pilot. You don't want to know. Just do your job and you'll get out of this fine." I wanted to push further, to demand answers, but the look in Frank's eyes stopped me. There was fear there, buried under his tough exterior. It was enough to make me think twice. Whatever was happening back there, Frank wasn't going to be the one to explain it to me. As the flight continued, the sounds from the cabin grew stranger. Beneath the chaotic laughter and clinking glasses, there were other noises, muffled cries, the low hum of voices speaking too quickly for me to make out the words. Once or twice, I thought I heard someone singing, though the melody was warped, off-key, and eerily out of place. At one point, I felt a thud against the cockpit door. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me jump. Frank didn't react, his focus locked on the controls. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound didn't come again. When I stole another glance through the window, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. One of the models was leaning over a boy in the corner, her hand on his shoulder as she whispered something into his ear. The boy nodded mechanically, his movements stiff and jerky. The model smiled, her expression predatory, and guided him toward the back of the cabin, where a curtain obscured whatever lay beyond. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words caught in my throat. Frank's earlier warning echoed in my mind. Just do your job. We began our descent toward the island a few hours later, and the sight of it momentarily took my breath away. The turquoise water sparkled under the midday sun, and the island itself was a lush paradise, dotted with pristine mansions and private beaches. But as we drew closer, that initial awe faded, replaced by a creeping unease. The island was beautiful, yes, but it was also isolated. There were no signs of life beyond the handful of luxury homes, no boats in the water, no cars on the winding roads. It was as if the island existed outside of reality, a world unto itself. Once we landed, the passengers disembarked quickly. Diddy was the first to leave, followed by his entourage and the children. I watched as the group was loaded into a fleet of sleek black SUVs that waited on the tarmac. The children walked single file, their heads down, their movements eerily synchronized. A man in a suit approached Frank and me as we finished our post-flight checks. "You'll be staying overnight," he said curtly, handing us each a small envelope. "Accommodations and instructions are inside. Don't leave your rooms unless called. Understood?" He nodded, though my gut twisted at his words. "What's the party for?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The man's eyes narrowed. "It's none of your concern," he said, his tone icy. "You're here to assist if needed, that's all." As we were driven to the staff quarters, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stepped into something far bigger than I could comprehend. The island might have been a paradise on the surface, but beneath its beauty, something dark was festering. Chapter 4. The Party Begins. The drive to the mansion was short, but it felt like an eternity. My co-pilot Frank and I sat in tense silence, the hum of the SUV's engine the only sound between us. The driver didn't make small talk, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. As we approached the mansion, its size and grandeur loomed larger than I'd imagined. The sprawling estate glowed in the evening light, its manicured lawns and towering fountains painting a picture of perfection. But beneath the beauty, the same sense of unease gnawed at my gut. The car stopped in front of the main entrance, and a guard immediately opened my door. He was tall and imposing, his expression unreadable as he gestured for us to get out. "Follow me," he said curtly. We were led into a side wing of the mansion, away from the grand staircase and gilded chandeliers that adorned the main foyer. This area was less opulent, but still unnervingly pristine. The walls were lined with dark wood panels, and the air was thick with an artificial floral scent that barely masked something heavier, more chemical. A stern-looking woman waited for us in a small, sparsely furnished room. Without so much as a greeting, she handed each of us a folded outfit. I unfolded mine and immediately felt my face flush. It was a short, tight-fitting vest and tailored black slacks that were far too snug. The material felt cheap and uncomfortably thin. The outfit wasn't just inappropriate, it was humiliating. "This is a joke, right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman's gaze didn't waver. "Change," she said flatly. "Phones and personal items go in the bin, no exceptions." Elian calmed to shake his head. Frank muttered something under his breath but obeyed, removing his phone and wallet before reluctantly changing into the outfit. I hesitated, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The thought of being completely cut off made my stomach churn, but the guards standing near the door didn't leave much room for negotiation. "Let's go," one of them barked when we were ready, his tone sharp enough to make me flinch. We were escorted down a series of hallways that seemed to spiral deeper into the mansion. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The soft carpet muffled our footsteps, and the dim lighting cast long, flickering shadows. Occasionally, we passed other staff members, housekeepers, servers, and what looked like security personnel, their faces blank and their eyes averted. It was as if they'd been trained to be invisible. At one point, I noticed a heavy wooden door slightly ajar. Through the crack, I caught a glimpse of shelves lined with bottles of baby oil, stacks of neatly folded towels, and what looked like medical supplies. Before I could process what I was seeing, a guard stepped in front of me, blocking my view. "Keep moving," he said, his voice low and firm. We reached a larger room where the rest of the staff had gathered. The guards began conducting searches, patting everyone down with meticulous thoroughness. When it was my turn, the guard's hands pressed against every seam and pocket of my outfit, lingering just long enough to make the process feel invasive. He even checked my shoes and ran a scanner over me before finally stepping back. "No recording devices, no phones, no questions," he said. "Break the rules and you'll regret it." The weight of his words settled over me like a lead blanket. I exchanged a glance with Frank, who looked just as uncomfortable as I felt. Neither of us said a word. Once the searches were complete, we were briefed by another guard, this one older, with a scar running down the side of his face. He spoke quickly, his tone clipped and authoritative. "Your job tonight is to serve drinks and assist guests as needed. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not ask questions. And most importantly, do not wander into restricted areas. Is that clear?" The murmur of agreement rippled through the staff, but my mind was racing. Restricted areas? What could possibly be so secret that they needed to issue such a stern warning? The party was already in full swing when we entered the main hall. The space was massive, with vaulted ceilings, glittering chandeliers, and walls lined with priceless artwork. Guests moved through the room in dazzling attire, their laughter echoing off the marble floors. But beneath the glamour, there was something off. The laughter was too loud, the smiles too forced. It felt like everyone was performing, playing a part in an elaborate charade. I took my place near the bar, where a line of staff members was busy preparing drinks. The bartender handed me a tray of cocktails and gestured for me to serve them to the guest. As I moved through the crowd, balancing the tray in my hands, I began to notice the peculiarities. Some guests sipped their drinks slowly, their eyes darting around the room as if they were waiting for something. Others were more brazen, downing glass after glass with reckless abandon. A few stood in small clusters, whispering and glancing over their shoulders like they were sharing secrets they didn't want overheard. But the drinks themselves were the most unsettling part. Back at the bar, I watched as a staff member added a fine pink powder to each glass, stirring it in until it dissolved. The bartender worked quickly, his movements precise and deliberate, but there was no mistaking the substance. "What is that?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice low. The bartender barely glanced at me. "None of your business," he said curtly. "Just serve the drinks." A faint smile. I hesitated, the tray in my hands suddenly feeling heavier. Whatever was in those drinks, it wasn't just alcohol. The guests were consuming it without hesitation, their behavior becoming more erratic with each sip. Laughter turned into shrill giggles. Conversations grew louder and more disjointed, and some guests even began to stumble, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. My unease deepened when I caught sight of the children. They were scattered throughout the room, their small figures dwarfed by the opulence around them. Unlike the adults, they weren't drinking or participating in the festivities. They sat quietly, their eyes downcast and their expressions blank. It was as if they were invisible, unnoticed by the crowd around them. At one point, a boy no older than 10 walked past me, clutching a small stuffed animal to his chest. His steps were slow and deliberate, his face devoid of emotion. I wanted to ask him if he was okay, but a guard appeared out of nowhere, herding him back toward the far end of the room. The night wore on, and the atmosphere grew heavier. The laughter that had once filled the room now felt hollow, almost frantic. The guests moved through the space like actors in a surreal play, their actions becoming increasingly bizarre. I saw one man collapse onto a couch, his body limp as 2 staff members hovered over him, administering what looked like an injection. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Not without answers. Chapter 5. A Disturbing Night. The night pressed on, and the mansion's air grew thick with tension. The sounds of the party shifted from jovial to something darker. Wild laughter mixed with muffled cries, creating a symphony of unease that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. I carried trays of drinks from the bar to the guests, avoiding eye contact and focusing on the task at hand. But no matter how much I tried to detach myself, the unsettling details were impossible to ignore. The guests' behavior had taken a sharp turn. What started as flirtatious laughter and casual drinking had devolved into erratic movements and disjointed conversations. One woman stumbled through the room, her laughter manic as she clung to a man who looked equally unsteady. Another guest sat slumped in a chair, their head lolling as if they were barely conscious. Around them, staff moved quickly and efficiently, cleaning up spills, replacing drinks, and subtly guiding the most intoxicated guests out of sight. It was the children, though, that unsettled me the most. Scattered throughout the room, they sat stiffly on chairs or quietly against walls, their faces pale and their eyes wide. None of them spoke or played, their silence a stark contrast to the chaos around them. At one point, I saw a girl no older than 8, clutching a stuffed animal that looked worn and handmade, her tiny fingers gripping it so tightly her knuckles were white. She flinched when a man stumbled too close, shrinking into herself as if trying to disappear. "Who brought these kids here?" I whispered to Frank during a brief moment behind the bar. He shook his head, his jaw tight. "Don't ask. Just don't." I wanted to push further, to demand answers, but his expression stopped me. Frank wasn't just tense. He was terrified. Whatever he knew, he had no intention of sharing, and that only made my unease grow. As I moved through the room, I noticed a pattern. Groups of children were being quietly ushered toward a hallway at the far end of the mansion. The staff guided them with practiced precision, their movements efficient and unyielding. One by one, the kids disappeared behind a heavy door that was quickly shut behind them. I paused, straining to hear what was happening, but the sounds of the party drowned out any noise from the hallway. I felt a tap on my shoulder and turned to see a guard holding a tray with 2 drinks. His expression was unreadable as he thrust the tray toward me. "Your turn," he said flatly. "What?" I asked, my stomach dropping. "Everyone drinks. It's the rule." His tone left no room for argument. I glanced at the glasses. The liquid inside shimmered unnaturally, its bright pink hue catching the light in a way that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to refuse, but the guard's gaze bore into me. Frank was already reaching for one of the glasses, his hand trembling as he raised it to his lips. "Do it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just do it." Reluctantly, I picked up the glass, the cold surface slick against my palm. The smell was sweet, almost sickeningly so, and the liquid clung to the sides of the glass like syrup. I brought it to my lips and took a small sip, the bitterness of the drink catching me off guard. The taste was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, thick and cloying, with a metallic aftertaste that made my throat tighten. Almost immediately, a wave of dizziness washed over me. My vision blurred, and the sounds of the party grew muffled, as if I were underwater. My legs felt unsteady, and I gripped the edge of a nearby table to keep from collapsing. The room seemed to warp around me, the edges of my vision darkening as the guests' laughter and music merged into a chaotic hum. I tried to focus, to steady myself, but the world refused to stay still. Faces around me distorted, their features stretching and twisting in ways that didn't seem possible. A man's laughter morphed into a guttural growl, his teeth bared in a grotesque grin. A woman's eyes glowed unnaturally, her head tilting at an impossible angle as she watched me with a predatory gaze. And then I saw the children again. They were lined up near the far end of the room, their expressions blank as they were led toward the hallway. One boy turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine for a split second. There was something in his gaze, a plea, a warning, or maybe just fear. But before I could process it, he was gone, swallowed by the shadows beyond the heavy door. I don't remember what happened next. The world spun violently, and I felt myself falling, the cold marble floor rushing up to meet me. My head hit something hard, and then there was nothing but darkness. When I woke, the room was quiet. The once bustling party had dissolved into eerie stillness, the air thick with the stench of sweat, alcohol, and something metallic. I pushed myself up slowly, my body aching as if I'd been hit by a truck. My clothes were disheveled, my shirt stained with dark smudges I didn't recognize. My hands trembled as I touched my face, feeling the sticky residue of what I could only assume was the drink I'd been forced to consume. Surroundings were unrecognizable. The grand hall was empty, the once bright chandeliers now casting dim, flickering light. Glasses and bottles littered the floor, their contents pooling in sticky puddles that glimmered in the weak light. Chairs were overturned, and the walls bore smudges and scratches that hadn't been there before. I looked down at my arms and froze. Bruises, dark and angry, covered my skin, along with faint scratches that stung when I moved. My legs felt weak, and my head throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. I struggled to piece together what had happened, but my mind was a haze, fragments of distorted images and muffled sounds flashing in and out of focus. A sound behind me made me jump, a soft shuffle, followed by a faint creak. I turned to see one of the children standing in the doorway, their wide eyes fixed on me. They didn't say anything, but their presence was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Before I could speak, the child turned and disappeared down the hallway, their small figure swallowed by the shadows. I wanted to follow, to find out what was happening, but my legs refused to move. The weight of exhaustion and fear pinned me in place, leaving me alone in the wreckage of the night. Chapter 6. Breaking Point. I sat in the dimly lit corner of the break room, staring blankly at the coffee cup in my trembling hands. The liquid inside was cold and untouched, its faint aroma doing little to ground me. My thoughts raced, fragments of the night flashing through my mind like a broken film reel. The bruises on my arms throbbed with each beat of my heart, a painful remember of the nightmare I couldn't fully remember. Every muscle in my body ached, and my skin felt raw, as if it were rejecting even the air around me. Frank sat across from me, his head in his hands. He hadn't spoken since we returned from the mansion, his silence doing more to unnerve me than any words could. He looked as broken as I felt, his face pale and eyes bloodshot. I wanted to ask him what he remembered, but I couldn't bring myself to break the oppressive silence that had settled between us. Whatever had happened, we were both grappling with the weight of it in our own way. My thoughts were interrupted by the sharp click of a door opening. 2 guards entered the room, their towering figures casting long shadows across the walls. Their presence was suffocating, the air growing heavy with the unspoken authority they carried. One of them held a sleek black tablet, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. "Come with us," one of them said, his voice cold and clipped. I exchanged a wary glance with Frank, who shook his head almost imperceptibly, as if warning me not to resist. Swallowing my fear, I stood and followed the guards out of the room, my legs feeling like lead with every step. They led me down a narrow hallway, the sterile white walls glaring under the harsh fluorescent lights. The silence was broken only by the sound of our footsteps, the rhythmic echo amplifying my growing dread. We entered a small office, sparsely furnished with a single desk and chair. The guards motioned for me to sit, and I hesitated before lowering myself into the chair. One of them placed the tablet in front of me and swiped the screen, bringing up a video feed that made my stomach drop. It was me. The footage showed me in the mansion, my movements jerky and disoriented. My face was flushed, my eyes glazed over, as if I were in a trance. I watched in horror as the version of myself on the screen stumbled through the room, interacting with people I didn't recognize. The details of what I was doing blurred into a haze of shame and disbelief, but the implications were clear. I had been a participant in whatever horrors unfolded that night. "That's enough," the guard said, pausing the video. His tone was devoid of emotion, but his eyes bored into mine with calculated intensity. "We have plenty more where that came from. You do well to keep quiet about everything." And opened my mouth to protest, to explain that I couldn't remember any of it, but the words caught in my throat. The other guard stepped closer, his towering frame looming over me. "This isn't a negotiation," he said. "You'll keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for you." "What happens if I don't?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. The first guard leaned in, a predatory smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Let's just say your family wouldn't appreciate seeing this footage. Imagine your wife, your kids. Would they understand? Or would they see you as we do now?" A cold shiver ran down my spine as the weight of his words sank in. They weren't just threatening me. They were threatening everything I held dear. My chest tightened as panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but I forced myself to stay composed. Showing fear would only embolden them. "I understand," I said finally, my voice trembling despite my efforts to steady it. "Good," the guard replied, straightening up. "Now get out of here and stick to your job. Don't make us regret letting you walk out of this room." They dismissed me with a wave, and I stumbled back into the hallway, my mind racing. Frank was waiting for me back in the break room, his expression grim. He didn't ask what had happened, and I didn't volunteer the information. Instead, we sat in silence, the weight of our shared ordeal pressing down on us like a suffocating fog. As the hours passed, the sense of isolation grew unbearable. The other staff avoided eye contact, their movements robotic and calculated. The guards seemed to be everywhere, their watchful eyes a constant reminder that we were under surveillance. Even Frank, who had been my sole source of solace, withdrew further into himself, his silence bordering on eerie. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion held more secrets than I could comprehend. Snatches of whispered conversations floated through the hallways, fragments of words that hinted at something far larger than a single night's debauchery. "Cleanup crew will handle it." Said the clerk. "No leaks. Not this time. Keep it contained at all costs." Each snippet was like a puzzle piece, tantalizingly close to forming a coherent picture, but just out of reach. I tried to piece together what little I knew, but the gaps in my memory loomed large, mocking my attempts to make sense of it all. Late that evening, I wandered the corridors of the staff quarters, unable to sleep. The mansion was unnervingly quiet, the once bustling halls now eerily empty. I passed by a room where two guards stood outside, their stony expressions giving nothing away. From within, I heard muffled voices, one calm and measured, the other frantic and pleading. "Please, I didn't mean to." The voice was cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, menacing murmur that sent a chill down my spine. I quickened my pace, not wanting to draw attention to myself. As I turned a corner, I caught sight of a door slightly ajar, the soft glow of a computer screen spilling out into the hallway. Curiosity warred with fear as I approached cautiously, peering inside. The room was a makeshift office, cluttered with papers, monitors, and surveillance equipment. On one of the screens, a live feed from the mansion's main hall played, showing a group of staff cleaning up the remnants of the party. Another screen displayed what looked like a storage room, rows of shelves lined with nondescript boxes. May names, dates, and dollar amounts scrolling by in rapid succession. Before I could make sense of what I was seeing, the sound of footsteps approaching sent me scrambling back into the shadows. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding as a figure entered the room and closed the door behind them. I didn't wait to see who it was. I hurried back to my quarters, every nerve on edge. That night, sleep eluded me once again. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the day replayed in my mind. The guards' threats, the incriminating footage, the whispers of a larger operation. It all pointed to something far more sinister than I had imagined. I felt like a pawn in a game I didn't understand, surrounded by forces far beyond my control. As exhaustion finally pulled me under, one thought lingered in my mind. I needed to find a way out. Whatever was happening in that mansion, I couldn't let it consume me. But escaping wouldn't be easy, not when every move I made was being watched. Chapter 7. The Departure. The morning of our departure came like a thief in the night, sudden and unwelcome. My body felt heavy, the bruises and aches a dull but constant reminder of everything I'd endured. The message came early, a curt knock on the door and a monotone guard informing us, "Pack your things, you leave in 2 hours." Frank nodded numbly, barely looking up as the door clicked shut. His movements were sluggish as he stuffed his belongings into his bag, and I found myself mirroring his silence. Words felt useless now, their power stripped away by the crushing weight of the past few days. The very air in the room felt oppressive, thick with unspoken fear and shared trauma. "It's almost as if they're waiting for the shadow to escape," thought Frank. I zipped up my own bag, my mind racing as I tried to anticipate what might come next. Would they let us leave quietly, or would this be the moment they decided we knew too much? Every step felt like I was walking a tightrope, the chasm of uncertainty yawning below. Trempy braced himself as I headed for the tower. When we were finally ready, a guard escorted us back to the mansion. The opulence that had once been intimidating now felt grotesque, the gleaming marble floors and glittering chandeliers mocking the darkness that festered beneath the surface. We were led into a small room near the main entrance, where Diddy waited. He was seated in a high-backed chair, his posture relaxed but commanding. His suit was immaculate, his presence oozing charisma, but there was an edge to his smile, a predator sizing up his prey. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, his voice like honey laced with poison. "I hope your stay was enlightening." Neither Frank nor I responded. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, unwilling to meet his piercing eyes. He chuckled softly, the sound sending a chill down my spine. "You've done well," he continued. "Your professionalism hasn't gone unnoticed." There was a pause, and I dared to glance up. His expression had shifted, his smile growing colder. "But I trust I don't need to remind you about the importance of discretion. What happens here stays here. Always." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I swallowed hard, nodding mechanically. Franks gave a stiff nod as well, his jaw clenched tightly. Diddy's smile returned, wider this time, but no less menacing. Good, that's what I like to hear. He gestured toward the door and another guard entered, carrying 2 sleek black suitcases. The guard placed one in front of each of us, the metallic clasps glinting under the overhead light. "A token of appreciation for your services," Diddy said, his tone almost mocking. "Consider it a thank you for your silence." "Alamona." I hesitated, my hands trembling as I reached for the suitcase. The weight of it surprised me, heavier than I'd anticipated. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. Stacks of cash, blood money tainted by the horrors we'd been complicit in. Frank took his suitcase without a word, his face a mask of suppressed emotion. Diddy stood, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the room. "Safe travels," he said, his voice dripping with finality. "And remember, gentlemen, loyalty is everything." With that, we were dismissed. The guards escorted us to the tarmac, the gleaming jet waiting like a bird of prey. The co-pilot and I boarded in silence, the familiar confines of the cockpit offering no comfort this time. Every switch and lever felt foreign, the routine motions of preparing for takeoff, mechanical and hollow. Frank settled into his seat, his movements robotic. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered, breaking the silence for the first time since we'd left the mansion. I nodded, my throat too tight to respond. As we taxied down the runway, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My eyes darted to the control panel, scanning the instruments for anything out of place. Everything seemed normal, but the weight of the surveillance cameras in the cabin felt like a brand against my skin. Even in the cockpit, I felt exposed, as if unseen eyes were still following my every move. The jet lifted off the ground, the roar of the engines filling the silence between us. I stared straight ahead, my hands gripping the controls tightly. My mind replayed the events of the past few days on an endless loop. The eerie silence of the children, the strange substances in the drinks, the cryptic warnings from the staff. Each memory felt like a stone tied to my chest, pulling me deeper into an abyss I couldn't escape. Frank spoke again, his voice low and strained. "Do you think we'll ever forget this?" I didn't answer. I didn't know if I could. The flight back was uneventful, but the tension in the cockpit was suffocating. Neither of us spoke after that, the silence stretching out like a vast, unbridgeable gulf. The once familiar routines of flying felt meaningless now, a hollow echo of the life I'd known before. When we finally touched down, I felt no relief, only a dull, gnawing dread. The guards were waiting for us at the hangar, their expressions unreadable as they handed us our personal belongings. My phone felt foreign in my hand, its weight a stark reminder of how much control I'd lost over my own life. One of the guards stepped closer, his voice a low growl. "Remember what we said. No one hears about this, ever." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Frank did the same, his silence a mirror of my own. As we walked away, the suitcases in our hands felt like anchors, dragging us down with every step. Back in the car, I opened my phone and stared at the screen. Dozens of missed calls and messages from my wife lit up the display, each one a dagger to my heart. I wanted to call her, to tell her I was okay, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain the inexplicable? How could I tell her what I'd seen, what I'd done? Frank broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll never be the same, will we?" I shook my head, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. "No," I said, my voice cracking. "We won't." The drive home was a blur, the landscape passing by in a haze of muted colors. When I finally stepped through the door of my house, the weight of the suitcase felt unbearable. My wife greeted me with a smile that faded the moment she saw my face. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Just a tough trip," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm glad to be home." But as I hugged her and my children, the lies felt like poison in my veins. The suitcase sat in the corner of the room, a silent testament to everything I couldn't say. And as the night wore on, I realized that the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Chapter 8: Uncertainty and Fear. When I stepped through my front door, it should have felt like a sanctuary, a place where the horrors of the past few days could fade into the background. Instead, it felt like stepping into another prison, one with walls of guilt and shadows of fear lurking in every corner. My wife greeted me with a cautious smile, her eyes scanning my face like she was trying to decode the turmoil beneath the surface. "You're back," she said, her voice warm but laced with concern. "How was it?" I forced a smile, the kind you wear when every muscle in your body is screaming to crumble. "It was fine," I said flatly, avoiding her gaze. "Just a long trip." The kids barreled into the room, their joyous shouts momentarily cutting through the suffocating tension. "Daddy!" they yelled in unison, wrapping their small arms around me. Their laughter should have been a balm for my frayed nerves, but instead it sent a pang of guilt through my chest. They had no idea how far I'd fallen, or what kind of nightmare I'd stumbled into. I held them tightly, closing my eyes as if I could block out the images burned into my mind. The children on that jet, their blank faces, their robotic movements. It all felt too close. My daughter's voice brought me back to the moment. "Did you bring something, Daddy?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. I stammered, my mind grasping for an excuse. "Not this time, sweetheart. Next trip, I promise." They didn't press, their attention quickly shifting to the toys scattered across the floor. My wife lingered, her expression unreadable. "Are you sure everything's okay?" she asked softly. "Just tired," I said, brushing past her to set down the suitcase. I could feel her eyes on my back, her suspicions simmering just beneath the surface. She knew me too well to buy my excuses, but I wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That night, the house felt impossibly quiet. My wife had gone to bed, and the kids were sound asleep, their soft snores drifting down the hall. I sat alone in the living room, the suitcase staring back at me from the corner like a specter. I hadn't opened it yet. I didn't need to. I knew what was inside, and the thought of touching that money made my skin crawl. Instead, I focused on the laptop in front of me, the screen glowing in the dark. I'd spent hours staring at it, the cursor blinking on an empty email draft. I'd typed and deleted the same message a dozen times, each version more feeble than the last. "To whom it may concern," I typed slowly. "I have information about an illegal operation involving..." My fingers hovered over the keys. Even now, the words felt like a death sentence. I could still feel Diddy's presence looming over me, his charming yet menacing voice echoing in my mind. Loyalty is everything. I slammed the laptop shut, the sound reverberating through the room. My hands were trembling, my chest tight with a mix of fear and rage. What could I even do? Exposing the truth would mean putting my family in unimaginable danger, but staying silent felt like complicity, a betrayal of the values I thought I stood for. The next morning, the paranoia set in. It started small, an unfamiliar car parked across the street, the same one I'd noticed the night before. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a neighbor had guests. But by midday, the car was still there, its tinted windows offering no glimpse of who might be inside. Every time I looked, I felt its presence, a silent reminder that I wasn't free. The phone calls came next. At first, they were just static, an empty line that crackled faintly before cutting off. Then came the anonymous numbers, each call ringing just long enough to jangle my nerves before disconnecting. I stopped answering after the fifth one. But the calls kept coming, relentless and mocking. I started seeing shadows where there shouldn't have been any, hearing faint noises in the stillness of the night. Footsteps on the sidewalk, a creak in the hallway, the distant hum of an engine idling too long. My mind was unraveling, every sound and movement feeding the growing sense of dread that coiled tighter around my chest. My wife finally confronted me 3 days later. She found me in the kitchen, staring out the window at the same car that hadn't moved since I got home. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone gentle but firm. "You've been acting strange ever since you got back. And that suitcase," she gestured toward the corner where it still sat, untouched. "You haven't even opened it. Did something happen?" I opened my mouth to answer but couldn't find the words. How could I tell her the truth, that I'd been dragged into something so monstrous it defied explanation, that I'd stood by while terrible things happened, too cowardly to intervene? "It's just work," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Stressful trip." "A bit better." She didn't look convinced. "You can talk to me, you know. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." I nodded, forcing a weak smile. "I know. Thanks." She left it at that, but I could see the worry etched on her face. I'd never lied to her before, not like this. The weight of my deceit felt heavier than the suitcase in the corner, and I wondered how long I could keep it up before everything came crashing down. The decision to act came late one night when the guilt became too much to bear. I sat down at my laptop again, my hands trembling as I typed out a message to a journalist known for exposing corruption. The email was blunt and to the point, detailing everything I'd seen and heard. I attached the footage I'd secretly saved, evidence that could blow the whole operation wide open. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, the cursor hovering over the send button. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and ragged. I knew what pressing that button would mean. It would paint a target on my back, on my family's back. But it would also mean justice, a chance to shine a light on the darkness I'd witnessed. My finger hovered over the trackpad, my mind racing. What if they find out? What if they come after us? A faint sound broke my concentration, a soft whisper, like a child's voice drifting through the silence. "They're still watching you." The man smiled and replied, lifting his hands. "You have..." I froze, my blood running cold. I glanced around the room, but there was no one there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, my heart pounding like a drum. Was it real, or just my mind playing tricks on me? The email stayed unsent. I closed the laptop slowly, my hands trembling as I pushed it aside. The darkness pressed in around me, heavy and suffocating. I sat there for hours, staring into the void, too afraid to move, too afraid to act. The truth was out there, locked inside my head and my hard drive. But whether it would ever see the light of day, I didn't know.